So next, let's talk about how we deliver SaaS to end users. And that means we're talking about not only browsers, but of course, mobile devices. Now, when Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, it was not the first smartphone that had graphics, installable apps, the ability to access a data network, but it was arguably the most successful and really changed the nature of how people access software as a service. So much so that just about a little more than 10 years after its introduction, more than half of all visits to SaaS and web pages were coming from mobile devices like smartphones, not from desktop or laptop browsers. And as of this year, 2020, about 50% of the world's population has access on a regular basis to a smartphone. That's a pretty incredible tear for a relatively new technology, and it means that when we're designing software as a service, we have to design with that in mind. We can design mobile first or mobile friendly. Mobile friendly means that you expect your site to be used on a variety of different types of devices, and it has to look reasonably good on any of them. Mobile first means you expect it to be used almost exclusively or primarily on a mobile device, maybe never even used in a desktop. And there are different design approaches that you can take either way. But as software designers, the questions we have to ask are, first of all, what does it mean to be able to use a site on multiple different sizes of screens with different usability affordances? That property is often referred to as responsiveness, that as the dimensions and nature of the display are changing, the site does something useful. You get a real useful user experience in either case. And it means thinking about interaction. When you're using a mouse or a touchpad to navigate around a screen, that's a very different experience than when you're using your button to touch a screen or to tap on things or double tap. So as we think about software as a service, we would ask, what are the technologies that are available to help us build apps for software as a service that are both responsive and thoughtful about the way that they expose interactions to the end user? So to do software as a service, you have to know something about HTML, or the hypertext markup language, the original language developed for representing web pages. We call it a lingua franca in that no matter how you're designing your app, even if you're designing a native smartphone app, which we won't talk about that much, you really have to know something about where the structure of these pages originally comes from. Now, in 1990, browsers ran on big screens. They ran on a desktop or maybe a laptop computer in the mid-90s, but today those screens can be anywhere from around 15 centimeters for a smartphone up to nearly a meter for very large desktop monitors. And for users who have visual disabilities and may rely on screen reading software, the screen may not even exist. So fortunately, there is some machinery that will help us design applications that serve all of those users reasonably well. And one of the key technologies is cascading style sheets, or CSS, whose goal is to separate the appearance of how a page should be displayed, the layout of the elements and so on, from the logical structure of that page, which is what HTML helps us express. One of the big ideas that is going to come out of this segment is the idea of a CSS selector. That's basically a simple syntax for referring to one or more elements on an HTML page. Now, in this module, we're going to talk about CSS selectors primarily in connection with using those selectors to identify which elements on a page should receive certain kinds of visual styling. But as we'll see later on when we start talking about JavaScript, CSS selectors are also one of the main ways that portions of a page are identified so that JavaScript can operate on them. So being comfortable with how selectors work is a pretty important life skill for software as a service. Now, what about front-end frameworks? It seems like every few months there's a new front-end framework that becomes available. There are frameworks like Angular for building full-stack apps, Vue for building more like a user interface layer, Bootstrap, which we're going to talk about excessively, for creating a consistent visual look and feel with some baseline components. And I would argue that a good framework gives you at least three things. Aesthetics. So people who have some skill and background in graphic design have made some default choices about typography, colors, layout, and so forth, so that those of us, like me, who don't have those skills, are able to start from a baseline that at least will make our app look pretty good. If I just use the defaults, I can't screw it up too badly. Responsiveness. We mentioned the idea that as the screen size changes, your site should still behave in a usable way. So a good framework should give us nice facilities that will enable us to create a responsive design. It doesn't take all the work out of it, but it will give us machinery that allows us to focus our efforts on the content. And very important, accessibility. Not just people who rely on screen readers, but people who have different visual impairments, who may need to view a site using a larger font than the web browser's default, or who have difficulty distinguishing color contrasts. Again, some of these choices should be baked into a well-designed framework so that if you use most of the default settings, you should be able to do a good job serving the widest variety of possible users. So let's talk about these technologies one at a time. HTML, you've probably seen by osmosis. I've got here a paragraph of some text of a hypothetical book review for a book called The Dietary Preferences of Penguins. And to say that I'm going to mark up this text with HTML, hypertext markup language, just means that we're going to put things into the text using the same medium as the text itself, so just ASCII characters, that help us distinguish the structure of the text. For example, I've pulled out the introduction as a top-level heading, H1. I've got a paragraph here that's got some italics in it. I've got a bulleted list with a couple of different bullets in it. And if we were to display that page in a web browser with no other information using a browser's default settings, we'd probably get something like the top part of this slide, where the browser has some built-in defaults for what a top-level heading should look like and what a bulleted list should look like. So this is kind of our jumping off point. If we want to make these elements look different or better, this is where CSS comes in. So hypertext markup language is what? It's a way to represent a document as a hierarchy of elements. And by the way, the top level of the document is itself a single element. And those elements can consist of text. They can consist of other resources like images or JavaScript embedded in the page, forms that the user can fill in and submit back to the server. As you saw in our simple example, elements are delimited by these open and close tags. Some of those elements have content between the open and close tags, like hello world in this example. And some of them have attributes. So for example, we can say that a paragraph has a particular attribute called class, and the value of the class attribute is lead. Now, as we're about to see, although there are a number of different attributes that can attach to different types of elements, two attributes that it can attach to any element are class and ID. And those are particularly important when we talk about using CSS to alter the visual styling of our HTML pages. So what about cascading style sheets or CSS? You can place in the preamble, or what's called the head portion of your HTML document, a special kind of element called a link element that essentially gives the URL of another document, which is a style sheet that needs to be associated with this HTML page. The important things to remember about the HTML ID and class attributes are these. The ID must be unique within a page. So at most one element on a given page can have a given ID. The class attribute can be attached to many different elements. So many elements can have the same class. Even elements of completely different types can have the same class. So here I've given a simple example of a div element, which is really just a way of indicating logical blocks on the page. And this particular div has an ID, which is intro, and its class is text-success. Now, I've chosen this particular class because it helps us, it's an intro to using Bootstrap, which we're going to talk about next. And then here's a paragraph that might go on the page, and it's just got some text inside it. So how do we associate elements in an HTML document with style information in CSS that describes how to display those elements? Here, I've given a little snippet of HTML to give you an example of different ways to do it. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about CSS selectors. A selector is just a way of naming some subset of elements in an HTML document so that you can apply some style information to them. Now, one way that you can refer to a set of elements is you can refer to the type of element that it is. So for example, I could say any element that is of type heading 1, which is an H1 tag. But a much more common way to do it is to use the class name, because classes, remember, can not only be attached to multiple different elements, but any given element can have multiple classes as well. So you can apply multiple rules to the same element just by, for example, giving it multiple classes. So in this case, the CSS syntax for an element with a given class is to put a dot before the class name. So the second rule says any element that has the class container among its associated classes. And in our simple example here, that would be this div element at the top of the page. Remember that a div is an element that in and of itself does not display anything, but serves as sort of a logical boundary to separate the document into pieces. Another way that you can write a CSS rule or a selector is to specify the ID of an element. Now remember that only one element on a given page can have a given ID, so necessarily a CSS rule that refers to an ID can only possibly match one thing on that page. That's one reason that they're less frequently used. You could also use combinations of these. For example, if I give both a tag name, like div, and a class, like container, div.container means it has to be a div and it has to have the class container in order for the rule to match. I can also specify the hierarchical relationships. Remember that HTML allows some elements to be nested inside of other elements, like a paragraph inside of a div. So I could write a CSS rule that makes use of that hierarchy. For example, in this example, I've said that if I have a div, and it doesn't matter what classes or IDs that div has, I'm just saying any div, and inside that div, there's any element that has the class custName, then the styling rule should apply only in that case. So it's not enough for an element to have the class custName associated with it. It also has to be an element that is nested inside of a div element, or the rule doesn't apply. And of course, if a given element on the HTML page doesn't have any specific rule, then it will inherit the rules of the enclosing element. So for example, if I write a rule that applies to the div.container using the tag name and class syntax, then any other elements that are nested inside that div that matches are going to inherit the rules for that div by default, unless, of course, there are additional rules that match those elements and would override them. So in all of these cases, the goal is that we should let the HTML markup just specify what the logical structure of the page is, and we leave it to CSS to then match particular elements of the HTML with visual information. What if you look in a CSS file? What do those rules actually look like? Well, here's a really simple example just to give you the flavor. You can see that the CSS rules, just like selectors, can refer to element types, like body. They can refer to IDs. They can refer to classes independent of the element type. And you can get a sense of some of the properties that you can set. The fonts that are used, the colors that are used, whether text is centered or aligned. Now, this is the point where it's easy to fall into a pitfall and specify some of your own styling rules like font families and colors and the margins and padding around different elements. I would be very careful about doing that unless you also have some background and experience in graphic design, because you may end up making choices that at best are aesthetically not very pleasing and at worst might work against the goal of trying to make your web pages as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. Which is why most of the time my preference is to not write any CSS rules at all. I like to use frameworks, and a framework that we're going to introduce you to in this course is called Bootstrap. Bootstrap is an open source front-end presentation framework. It was originally developed at Twitter, and they were kind enough to release it as open source so anybody can use it without paying any sort of a license. And to give you a brief flavor of what it looks like when you decide to use Bootstrap CSS, I've called out in red on this little snippet of HTML a few places where you can specifically see the use of Bootstrap. And near the top, of course, is that all-important link element. That's the one that tells us what is the URL of the style sheet that should go with this HTML page. The full style sheet is not there, by the way, but you can follow the link in the lower right corner of the slide, and you can get this exact code with the full link and everything else. You can display it on your own computer. Down here, I've given this first div a class of container, and that's because if you read the Bootstrap documentation, basically to do anything else useful, you have to have the class container attached to some enclosing element. Otherwise, a lot of the great features that Bootstrap gives you won't really work. So if you scope some part of your page to a container like I've done, inside that container, I can now use some of the cool Bootstrap features. This class for text muted means that the text will be displayed in a slightly more conservative font, maybe not as bright. Class equals lead is a type of paragraph that Bootstrap will put in a slightly larger, more prominent, because it's a lead paragraph, like the opening of a story. And it's even got some simple styling rules that you can attach to bulleted lists. And I can now show you a preview of what this exact page would look like And again, you can use the link at the bottom of the slide to download it and try it out yourself if I display it in a typical web browser. So here's what that simple snippet of HTML would look like. You can see that the text that's muted is indeed in a slightly lighter font. You can see that the lead paragraph is in a slightly larger font than paragraphs would normally be. And I've chosen to apply some default styles to the bulleted list that happen to put the list in some frames. So this is just an extremely simple example of what you can normally do with Bootstrap CSS. But I'd like to show you a couple of examples that make it much more clear what the power of the framework is if it's well designed. Now, Bootstrap describes itself as a responsive mobile-first framework. It's particularly well suited for doing mobile apps. And a couple of things that it gives you that I'd like to illustrate in order to do that are, first of all, the idea of a responsive layout. So what does that mean? A responsive layout is one that allows you to design your page elements and specify how they should be laid out on the page in such a way that as the screen size varies from a small smartphone to a full-size desktop or laptop browser, the screen display does something useful. Let's look at an example. So here's a really simple example that uses Bootstrap and CSS to do a responsive navigation bar, or nav bar. This is a hypothetical page that's got sort of 3 different elements that you can navigate to: about, archives, and tags. But watch what happens if I start to make this page, this window, smaller and smaller. I'm going to shrink the window horizontally, and you can see that there's a point at which the navigation bar items disappear, and they're replaced by what some people call the hamburger menu. And in fact, if I go up to that menu and click it, you can see that now those navigation elements appear as a drop-down on the menu. So this was done without using JavaScript, without writing any code, just by carefully constructed CSS based on some of the facilities, some of the basic types and features that come with Bootstrap. Let's look at another example. Another thing that a good framework ought to give you is the idea of a component. What do I mean by a component? Well, the HTML elements are pretty low-level things, like a paragraph, a row of a table, an item in a bulleted list. But usually when you're creating a layout for a page, you're not thinking in terms of bullets and lists. You're thinking in terms of higher-level elements, like a selection carousel, or, for example, as in this great example I'm going to show you, which I got from Bootstrap's website, here's an example where you're not thinking in terms of individual paragraphs. The unit on this page really is one of these cards, where you can see there's 3 cards for 3 different pricing plans for a hypothetical product. Each card has sort of a headline piece. It's got a description piece. It's got a little button that hovers, that lights up when you hover over it. So in fact, in Bootstrap, the card is a component. You can essentially create a div and indicate that that div is going to play the role of a card on your screen, and then the elements that you put inside of that div will take on the correct appearance and layout behavior so that you can create pages like this. But again, more impressively, what happens as I start making the screen narrower and narrower to simulate what happens if we're viewing this page on, let's say, a tablet or a smartphone? You'll notice that at some point, 2 interesting things happen. First of all, the layout collapses and it goes from being 3 columns wide to being 2 columns wide. But we've managed to author the page so that the columns don't all have to be the same width. Apparently, we wanted to make sure that the enterprise pricing plan got special treatment. So we've basically specified that when the screen becomes narrow enough, give preference to making the enterprise plan wider and then just stack the other 2 on top. And if I continue to make the screen even narrower, at some point we'll get to where even 2 columns side by side is too wide, and now the whole thing has been stacked into a single column. So again, there's no JavaScript being used to do any of this. This is purely a property of how the page is authored using Bootstrap CSS, and a great example of responsive design. It behaves in a useful way on a wide variety of screen sizes. And finally, although these examples didn't give us a lot of opportunity to talk about it, accessibility. So information can be attached to different elements that help screen readers. For example, identifying certain elements as being related to navigating the page, even if those elements are not using the specific HTML tags that mean I am a navbar. So as we talk more about accessibility, remember that using some of the default behaviors that come with a good framework is a great start. And you're much less likely to sort of shoot yourself in the foot that way. So HTML and CSS, we know they came from the early days of the web when browsers ran on big screens. What are the best ways to build apps for mobile devices? I'll argue that there's basically three things that you can do. And the first is exactly what we just saw demonstrated. Use plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build apps with a framework such as Bootstrap that allow you to make those apps mobile friendly. You can also build what's called a wrapped website, which means you're still using those same tools to develop the app, but when you're all done, there's software packages that will allow you to essentially wrap that into a native app framework. So from the outside, for all practical purposes, it looks and behaves just like a native app for iOS or for Android. And of course, you could just build a native iOS or Android app. So what are the pros and cons of doing this? Well, I've tried to summarize them in this table, but part of the message is that as time goes by, with phone performance getting better, with hardware features that are available on different devices being available via JavaScript, there are really fewer and fewer reasons, in my opinion, to use a native framework to write the app. Yes, you will get better performance, absolutely. But depending on the type of app you're writing, unless it's a game or something that really requires access to very, very high performance on the device itself, might not make any difference. And when you decide to use a native framework, you're giving up a couple of pretty important advantages, in my opinion. First of all, you can no longer use the same tools and languages that you're using to develop the rest of your app. And in particular, if your app has to also work in browsers, you're now going to be developing at least two versions of it. In fact, probably more than two if you want your app to run on both Android and iOS, which are the two largest market share mobile platforms right now, because their programming environments are completely different from each other. So you're going to have to maintain multiple code bases for at least part of what should be a single app. And possibly the worst, in my opinion, is you lose the ability to do automatic updates. This is one of the big advantages of cloud computing and software as a service, was users who are accessing the app from a browser don't have to worry about installing software or installing updates on their computer. When you update the server, everybody sort of gets that update. And unfortunately, with installable apps, that kind of goes away. Even if you're using a wrapped application, that goes away. And in fact, when Twitter came out with their mobile app around 2014, about every 20 days, they would update their mobile app, which meant about every 20 days, you would get a pop-up reminding you that you needed to install an app update. So it's your call, but if it were up to me, I would try to do the most I can with the least extra effort. And the frameworks for building mobile-friendly and mobile-first apps with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have gotten really good. So to sum up what we've learned, HTML is the lingua franca of software as a service. It began with the web, it is still with us, and no matter what you do, you're going to have to learn the basics of how you put together an HTML page, and in particular, how cascading style sheets can be used to describe the styling of that page in a way that doesn't interfere with the page's logical structure, which is what HTML is supposed to expose. We highly recommend that when you do start styling your pages, that you use an off-the-shelf framework. Bootstrap is one of our favorites, but there are many choices. And any good framework should provide you with high-level elements, things like cards, carousels, and other collections of low-level HTML components that you can sort of take out of the box and use as elements of your page. It should provide you the ability to do responsive layout, which means on a variety of screen sizes, you can design to have a reasonably good user experience. It should provide support for accessibility so that the default choices that you make with the framework will result in a page that is usable by a wide variety of users. And most importantly, in my opinion, maybe, good taste. I have terrible graphic design skills, and I am so thankful to the kind people who work on frameworks like Bootstrap so that my websites don't have to look like they were designed by vandals. And finally, when you're building those apps out, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will take you a long way, and they'll do it without having you maintain multiple code bases and without losing the great advantage of software as a service that nobody ever needs to install the updates.